The warrior's scream echoed across the fjord as the blade found its mark. But this wasn't a battlefield death. This was something far more calculated, far more devastating. The man writhing on the ground had committed no crime against property, hadn't stolen cattle or burned grain stores. His only transgression was being accused of something that, in Viking society, was considered worse than murder itself. Within hours, he'd be dead, and his accuser would walk free, protected by laws that turned suspicion into a death sentence. But here's what will shock you about Viking attitudes toward what we now call homosexuality. The same culture that would execute a man for being called sexually passive worshipped gods who freely crossed gender boundaries. The same warriors who developed an elaborate legal system to destroy men through sexual accusations celebrated divine figures who transformed, transcended, and completely ignored the very rules that governed mortal behavior. Welcome to the most contradictory civilization in human history, where divine gender fluidity coexisted with mortal gender terror. Where gods could birth horses and practice women's magic while human men died for wearing the wrong clothes. This isn't the sanitized version of Viking culture you learned in school. This is the brutal reality of a society that weaponized masculine anxiety into a technology of control that would outlive their gods, their language, and their entire civilization. I'm about to reveal how the Vikings created something far more sophisticated than axes and longships. They engineered a system of sexual policing so effective that variations of it still operate today, still claim victims, still turn human connection into threat. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand why a culture that celebrated divine gender bending became history's most brutal enforcer of mortal gender conformity. But first, let me show you just how twisted this double standard really was, because it starts with the most powerful god in their pantheon doing something that would get any human killed. Picture Odin, the All-Father, king of the gods, seated on his throne in Asgard. He's draped in women's robes, practicing Cedar, the feminine magic that grants him power over fate itself. Below in Midgard, a farmer's tunic hangs slightly too long, resembling a dress, and he's facing accusations that will end in combat or death. The same act that makes Odin divine would make that farmer dead. This wasn't some minor contradiction. This was the foundation of Viking cosmology. Their most revered deities routinely violated every gender boundary that mortals were expected to die protecting. Loki, the shapeshifter, transformed into a mare, mated with a stallion, and gave birth to Odin's 8-legged horse, Sleipnir. This story wasn't whispered in shame or hidden in secret texts. It was celebrated in mead halls, carved into wood, passed down through generations as a triumph of divine cleverness. But change the protagonist from god to human, and everything shifts. The same transformation that demonstrated divine power would prove mortal perversion. The same boundary crossing that showed godly wisdom revealed human weakness. The double standard wasn't hypocrisy, it was hierarchy. Gods could transcend because they were gods. Humans had to remain fixed because they were human. Thor himself, the thunder god and ultimate warrior, once dressed as a bride complete with wedding gown and veil to retrieve his stolen hammer. The gods laughed at his cleverness. They composed poems celebrating his triumph. They turned his cross-dressing into a victory story told for centuries. But imagine a mortal warrior attempting the same disguise. He'd be bound and bleeding before sunset, facing accusations that offered only two outcomes: death in combat or death through social destruction. The Norse creation of this divine permission alongside mortal prohibition was genius in its cruelty. Through their gods, Vikings could explore every forbidden territory, but only vicariously, only through worship, never through action. The mythology provided the release valve while simultaneously reinforcing the prohibition. Every story of divine gender transgression reminded mortal men of what they could never do. Every tale of godly transformation emphasized what knowledge remained forever forbidden. But here's where it gets truly sinister. The gods didn't just break gender rules, they had given humans the very laws that made such breaking punishable by death. They'd handed down the social codes, the legal frameworks, the cultural expectations that trapped mortals in rigid performances while reserving complete freedom for themselves. The divine examples didn't provide permission, they reinforced prohibition. Listen to how the stories were structured. When Loki gave birth, the narrative celebrated the magnificent horse he produced. When Odin practiced women's magic, the focus was on the knowledge he gained. When Thor wore a wedding dress, The tale emphasized his successful retrieval of his hammer. The same actions that demonstrated divine versatility would prove mortal corruption if attempted by humans. This created a psychological pressure cooker. Vikings obsessed over boundaries they could never cross, powers they could never access, freedoms they could worship but never experience. The gods modelled the acquisition of power through gender transgression, while simultaneously forbidding mortals from following their example. Masculine anxiety became worship. Men turned their terror of forbidden territories into devotion to beings who freely explored them. The language itself reveals this obsession. Old Norse developed 7 different words for calling a man sexually passive, each one a precision weapon designed for maximum social destruction. Aga meant unmanly or cowardly in sexual terms. Reg suggested passive submission. Stroin implied being used sexually. Sordin meant penetrated. Sansordin meant demonstrably penetrated. The vocabulary was elaborate, specific, designed for different types of accusation and different levels of legal consequence. But search those same texts for words expressing love between men, and you'll find silence. The language could dissect masculine failure in minute detail, but couldn't express masculine affection. You could destroy a man with 7 different variations of sexual accusation, but you couldn't say you loved him. This wasn't linguistic accident. This was architectural design, creating a vocabulary that channeled all male relationships through competition, dominance, and carefully maintained distance. The precision of this destructive vocabulary reveals cultural obsession. Why develop such elaborate terminology for something supposedly abhorrent? Why create linguistic scalpels for dissecting masculine failure? Because these weren't just insults. They were legal triggers, social weapons, control mechanisms that could destroy lives through spoken words alone. Each term carried different implications and consequences. Some mandated immediate combat to the death, others enabled property seizure, all guaranteed social annihilation. The vocabulary was functional, designed to provide different pathways to destruction depending on the specific accusation and desired outcome. It was a toolkit for targeted demolition of masculine reputation. The poets understood this power intimately. Skilled wordsmiths could destroy a man more thoroughly than any warrior. Verses outlived wounds, words persisted past death, and reputation could be murdered through carefully crafted language that would be remembered and repeated for generations. The pen wasn't just mightier than the sword, it was more lethal. But while men died for touching each other, Viking women could share beds, exchange caresses, and express physical affection without anyone questioning their behaviour. The same society that created elaborate machinery to destroy men for suspected femininity barely noticed when women engaged in relationships with each other. This wasn't tolerance, it was invisibility born from irrelevance. Viking law codes that meticulously detailed every variation of male sexual transgression contained nothing about women with women. The sagas that destroyed men through implication ignored obvious female relationships. The poetry that weaponized male sexuality treated female intimacy as beneath notice. The same act that killed men was an ordinary Tuesday for women. Why this radical difference? Because women's sexuality didn't threaten the foundation of social order. Women couldn't hold political power, couldn't own substantial property, couldn't lead war bands. Their sexuality was irrelevant to power structures that were built around male dominance. You can't strip status from those who never had it. You can't threaten masculine privilege in those denied masculinity itself. This selective blindness exposed the true purpose of Viking sexual policing. It was never about the acts themselves, it was about power, hierarchy, and the maintenance of masculine dominance. Women's relationships were unpoliced because they were unpolitical. Men's relationships were hyper-policed because they threatened the entire structure of male supremacy. The tolerance of female same-sex relationships revealed what Vikings really protected. They weren't maintaining natural order or sexual morality. They were protecting the specific configuration of power that made men dominant and women subordinate. Any male sexual variant threatened that dominance. Female variants, existing outside power structures, threatened nothing. But this freedom came with its own dark price. Women could express same-sex affection precisely because Vikings considered such affection meaningless. They could build intimate relationships because those relationships didn't matter in the grand scheme of social power. The invisibility was double-edged, offering freedom through irrelevance. And this brings us to the most shocking revelation about Viking sexual control. The elaborate system they built to police masculine behaviour wasn't designed to protect morality or maintain divine order. It was engineered to prevent the one thing that could threaten their entire social structure: men forming bonds with each other that might challenge the hierarchy that kept everyone in their designated place. Next, we'll explore exactly how this system worked in practice, and why a single word could trigger violence that made battlefield combat look merciful by comparison. The word hung in the air like a blade about to fall. Argar. 3 syllables that transformed a crowded mead hall into an execution chamber. The accused man had exactly 5 seconds to respond before everyone present would know whether they were witnessing combat or cowardice. Because in Viking society, certain accusations didn't just demand answers, they demanded blood. Here's how the legal trap worked with mathematical precision. Someone calls you Arga, sexually passive, unmanly. The law now requires you to challenge them to single combat. Not suggests, not allows, requires. Refuse the challenge and you've legally confirmed the accusation. Accept your new status as less than human, less than alive in any meaningful sense. The genius of this system was its perfect inevitability. Every accusation guaranteed destruction, either immediate or prolonged. Option 1. Fight your accuser. Win and you've proven your masculinity through violence, though suspicion will linger like smoke. Lose and you die, but your family keeps their honor. Option 2. Accept the accusation through silence. Live as a social corpse, stripped of all legal rights, all human dignity, all possibility of meaningful existence. Picture the scene unfolding. A rival wants your land, your position, your wife. He doesn't need evidence or witnesses or elaborate schemes. He just needs to speak one word loud enough for others to hear. Argar. Suddenly, you're trapped in a legal mechanism designed to guarantee violence. The law didn't seek truth. It manufactured bloodshed with bureaucratic efficiency. The accusation itself was the verdict. No investigation followed, no testimony was heard, no evidence was examined. The word was spoken, combat was mandated, destruction was ensured. Either you died fighting, or you died socially. The system offered no third option, no escape clause, no possibility of peaceful resolution. But here's what made it truly diabolical. The accuser risked death too. Speak the word and you must fight. This wasn't casual insult hurled safely from a distance. This was mutual assured destruction, a social nuclear option that could eliminate both parties. Yet men continued to trigger this mechanism, continued to feed this machine of violence. Why? Because the alternative was worse than death. In a society where masculine reputation determined everything, property rights, legal standing, social existence itself, the risk of combat was preferable to the certainty of suspected femininity. Better to die maintaining the system than live questioning it. The law created its own ecosystem of professional destroyers. Skilled warriors could eliminate rivals through accusation, knowing they'd likely survive the mandated combat. Weaker men became targets, forced into battles they couldn't win or social deaths they couldn't survive. The strong preyed on the weak with legal sanction. And the witnesses, they weren't passive observers. They were part of the machine. Watch an accusation without participating and you might be next. The law required audience engagement, collective enforcement. Everyone became complicit in maintaining a system that could destroy them just as easily. Consider the premeditation this reveals. Viking law carefully defined which insults triggered mandatory combat. Call a man a thief, pay a fine. Call him a coward, offer compensation. Call him sexually passive, blood must flow. The hierarchy of insults revealed what Viking society truly prioritized. Not property, not courage, but the fiction of impenetrable masculinity. The words themselves were precision instruments. Arga meant passive in sexual terms. Raga suggested submission. Stroin implied being used. Each term designed to trigger specific legal responses, different levels of social destruction. This wasn't crude name-calling. This was surgical vocabulary for targeted annihilation. But the real horror was what happened to those who survived accusations. Win your combat and what have you won? You've proven you can kill, not that you're innocent. The whispers follow you home. Maybe he fought so desperately because he had something to hide. Maybe the accusation contained truth after all. The system created perfect paranoia. Every man became a potential accuser, every gathering a potential trap. The law weaponized masculine anxiety, turned it into a control mechanism that required no enforcement beyond human fear. Men policed themselves and each other with religious devotion to rules that could destroy them. The trap was voluntary, which made it perfect. No external force compelled men to speak these deadly words or answer these fatal challenges. They chose to participate in their own imprisonment, their own systematic destruction. The law simply provided the framework. Terror did the rest. Medieval chroniclers who encountered this system were horrified by its efficiency. They described a culture where grown men lived in constant fear of casual conversation, where friendship itself became dangerous, where every interaction carried the possibility of lethal consequences. The Vikings had turned human connection into a minefield, but this legal machinery was just the beginning. The real sophistication of Viking sexual control revealed itself not in how they punished the accused, but in what they did to make examples of the conquered. Because the same culture that developed elaborate laws for destroying their own men had discovered something even more devastating to do to their enemies. The longship cut through dark waters toward shore, its deck transformed into a theatre of calculated horror. 23 captured warriors stood in formation, forced to witness something that would haunt them longer than any battlefield defeat. Their chieftain, who had led them through countless raids, who had stood first in every shield wall, was about to become a lesson in Viking innovation. This wasn't random brutality or heat-of-battle violence. This was systematic, engineered, designed with the precision of master craftsmen who had discovered something more powerful than death itself. The Vikings had learned to weaponize shame, to turn conquest into a technology of permanent psychological warfare. The positioning was deliberate. The height of the platform ensured maximum visibility. The angle of restraint guaranteed optimal psychological impact. The timing, always in daylight with forced witnesses, transformed individual assault into collective trauma that would ripple through entire communities. Every element served a calculated purpose in a machine designed to break more than bodies. Here's what made this system revolutionary. Traditional conquest meant killing leaders and subjugating populations. But dead chiefs became martyrs, rallying points for resistance, symbols of defiant honor. The Vikings had discovered something more effective than martyrdom. They created living ghosts who spread terror through their very existence. The selection process revealed surgical precision. They didn't choose victims randomly. They targeted leaders, chieftains, respected warriors, men whose masculinity was unquestioned and whose strength was proven. The higher the victim's status, the more devastating the demonstration. Destroy the untouchable and everyone else becomes touchable. Watch the psychological mechanics unfold, capture a rival warband. Instead of executing the leader, subject him to ritualized sexual assault before his men. Force them to watch their chief, the embodiment of masculine power, systematically unmanned. Then release them all. The Vikings had discovered that living weapons were more powerful than dead heroes. These men returned to their communities as walking proof of Viking dominance. They couldn't hide what happened because too many witnessed it. They couldn't lie because synchronized trauma ensured consistent stories. They couldn't recover because their own culture's machinery now turned against them. The genius was in the aftermath. Send the broken chief home with his traumatized crew and watch the social mechanics destroy him more thoroughly than any torture. His voice, once commanding, now triggered communal memory of subjugation. His presence reminded everyone of their collective powerlessness. His very existence became a weapon of ongoing psychological warfare. The ripple effects were calculated with mathematical precision. The chief's wife faced an impossible choice between supporting her destroyed husband or abandoning him to save herself. His children inherited not honor but association with degradation. His allies had to distance themselves or risk contamination. The Vikings had weaponized shame itself. The traumatized crew became vectors of terror, carrying synchronized nightmares back to their villages. Their inability to protect their leader translated into collective masculine failure. Every man who heard their story wondered if he could have done better, if resistance was even possible against such systematic destruction. This is where Viking innovation becomes truly sophisticated. They understood that in honor-based societies, reputation was more vital than life itself. Kill a man and his sons might seek vengeance, destroy his masculinity while leaving him breathing, and his own community would finish the job for you. The technology evolved with practice. Vikings learned which acts created maximum psychological damage, which positions triggered deepest shame, which audiences ensured widest dissemination of terror. This wasn't sadism. This was engineering applied to human psychology with devastating effectiveness. Consider the resources this system saved. Instead of garrisoning conquered territories or maintaining occupying forces, Vikings created self-enforcing subjugation. The victims' own communities became the enforcement mechanism. Social death required no Viking maintenance, no ongoing military presence, no administrative oversight. But here's the most chilling aspect of this innovation. The Vikings had discovered vulnerability encoded in masculine social architecture itself. The same structures that elevated male dominance contained instructions for their own demolition. They'd found the destroy command hidden in patriarchal programming and learned to execute it with surgical precision. The forced witnesses were crucial to the system's function. Individual victimization might be hidden, denied, or reframed over time, but collective witness created undeniable social fact that couldn't be erased or explained away. 20 warriors who saw their chief destroyed couldn't collectively forget or synchronize lies or maintain useful denial. Each witness became a walking reminder of Viking power. Every time these men gathered, their shared trauma surfaced like poison in a well. They couldn't rebuild warrior solidarity because the foundation had been publicly shattered. The warband dissolved not through death but through shared knowledge of absolute defeat. The broken chieftains became something worse than dead enemies. They became living advertisements for Viking supremacy, breathing proof that resistance was not just futile, but would result in fates worse than honourable death. The message spread through enemy territories like wildfire. Submit or face destruction that makes dying look merciful. But this systematic use of sexual violence as a weapon of conquest reveals something even darker about Viking society. The same culture that would execute its own men for sexual passivity had no problem using sexual domination as a tool of warfare. The contradiction exposes the true nature of their sexual obsessions. It was never about protecting morality or maintaining divine order. It was about power, pure and simple. Sexual control was a technology, and like all Viking technologies, it was designed for maximum effectiveness in achieving dominance over others. The blackened bones were discovered centuries later by Persian soldiers digging through Babylon's ruins, but they told a story that made even battle-hardened warriors step back in horror. Scattered among the remains were clay tablets bearing desperate warnings. He is beneath. Do not wake what sleeps below. These weren't the records of some forgotten battle or plague. They documented something far more sinister, something that connects directly to how sexual control became the ultimate weapon of civilizational collapse. Because here's what those Persian soldiers had uncovered without knowing it. The final evolution of the same system Vikings had perfected on longship decks. A technology of sexual domination so refined, so systematically brutal, that it literally consumed the civilization that created it. The tablets they found weren't just historical curiosities, they were crime scene evidence from humanity's darkest experiment in weaponized masculinity. The story begins with a 13-year-old boy named Shamashidi, grinding barley with his sister when temple officials arrived at their door. 3 priests in white robes, 2 guards, and behind them the selector, a woman whose eyes had witnessed too many boys taken, too many mothers destroyed. "We seek the one marked by heaven," she announced, though everyone knew what that really meant. This wasn't random conscription or military service. This was something far more calculated, far more devastating. The Ottoman Empire's devshirme system, which we explored earlier, was amateur hour compared to what these Babylonian priests had engineered. They had discovered how to transform the very act of male selection into a ritual that would literally tear holes in reality itself. The selection criteria were precise beyond modern understanding. Virgin boys between 8 and 18, physically perfect, spiritually pure according to their twisted metrics. But here's what made this system uniquely horrifying. They weren't collecting these boys for military service or administrative roles. They were gathering raw material for rituals that would make Viking sexual violence look like playground bullying. Watch how the machinery operated with bureaucratic precision. Teams of assessors visited markets across the empire, examining thousands of candidates like livestock. Height requirements, dental inspections, birthmark patterns, all meticulously documented. The selected weren't just physically perfect. They had to be orphans with no family ties, no one to miss them, no one to ask uncomfortable questions when they vanished forever. The truly disturbing part was the preparation phase. For 3 months, these 100 boys lived like princes in a special wing of the palace. The finest foods, daily purification baths, education in reading and writing. They were told they were being prepared for divine service, for the ultimate honor of serving the gods themselves. They had no idea they were being marinated for consumption. The boys were encouraged to write letters about their good fortune, their gratitude for being chosen. Archaeologists have found some of these tablets, young men writing enthusiastically about their honor, their excitement, their anticipation of divine service. They were writing their own obituaries without knowing it, documenting their psychological preparation for systematic destruction. The ritual chamber itself was a masterpiece of engineered horror. Carved from a single piece of black stone that didn't match any rock found near Babylon, the walls covered in symbols that predated cuneiform, that seemed to writhe when observed directly. The instruments hanging from walls weren't for worship. They were for systematic human modification, bronze hooks and blades designed for precise anatomical manipulation. But it was the pit in the centre that revealed the true purpose, 8 feet across, descending into darkness that seemed to breathe with its own rhythm. The air above it shimmered like heat waves despite the chamber's bone-deep cold. This wasn't just a place of sacrifice, it was an engineered gateway, a carefully constructed breach in the fundamental structure of reality itself. Here's where it connects to everything we've discussed about Viking sexual control. The Babylonians had taken the same basic technology, the weaponization of masculine vulnerability, and refined it to its ultimate expression. Where Vikings used sexual violence to break individual enemies, these priests used it to literally reshape the fabric of existence. The ritual required 100 virgin boys, transformed through months of preparation, into what they called perfect vessels. Their bodies were systematically modified, spines twisted into geometric patterns that matched the symbols on chamber walls, joints relocated to positions that shouldn't exist in human anatomy. They weren't being killed. They were being restructured into living conduits for forces that human minds couldn't comprehend. The mathematical precision was staggering. Every 13th moon, when celestial alignments created specific conditions, the gateway would weaken. What slept below would stir, reaching upward, seeking passage into our reality. It had to be fed, not with common blood, but with essence refined through systematic suffering, purified through elaborate torture, concentrated through methods that made Viking brutality look like mercy. But this is where the system revealed its fatal flaw. The very precision that made it so powerful also made it vulnerable. On that final night, as priests prepared to complete their ultimate ritual, something went catastrophically wrong. The carefully prepared vessel, a boy whose body had been transformed into a living symbol of summoning, died at the crucial moment. His heart simply stopped, not from injury or poison, but from the sheer impossibility of what was being demanded of human flesh. The gateway opened as planned, the hungry darkness rising to meet its promised meal. But without a living conduit to channel through, the forces below had no way to bind themselves to our reality. What followed was civilizational collapse on a scale that defied historical explanation. The darkness that poured from the unsealed gateway didn't just kill, it corrupted the very foundations of existence. Animals fled the city en masse, plants withered in perfect spirals radiating outward from the temple. The Euphrates River ran backward for 3 days, carrying things that shouldn't exist in any sane reality. The priests tried desperately to contain what they had unleashed, collapsing tunnels, sealing chambers, burning every record of what they'd attempted. But it was too late. The systematic sexual exploitation that had powered their civilization for centuries had finally consumed the civilization itself. Babylon fell not to Persian armies, but to the consequences of its own weaponized brutality. This is the ultimate lesson hidden in those clay tablets. Every system that weaponizes human sexuality against itself eventually devours the society that created it. The Vikings discovered this through their own collapse. The Christians through centuries of institutional self-destruction. The Ottomans through the systematic brutalization of their own people. The technology is too powerful, too fundamentally corrosive to human connection, to remain stable indefinitely. It spreads like poison through every relationship, every interaction, every possibility of genuine intimacy. Eventually, it destroys the very foundations of social cooperation that civilizations require to function. But here's the most terrifying realization from those Babylonian ruins. The system didn't die with the civilization that created it. It adapted, evolved, found new hosts. The same fundamental technology that collapsed ancient Babylon operates today in different forms, using different vocabulary, but serving the same basic function, preventing human connection through weaponized sexual anxiety. Those clay tablets weren't just historical artifacts. They were warnings from a civilization that had learned too late what happens when the machinery of sexual control reaches its logical conclusion. The breathing they described in the walls, the whispers in the darkness, the sense that something inhuman had been awakened. These weren't supernatural phenomena. They were the death rattles of a society that had finally poisoned itself with its own obsessions. The Persian soldiers who discovered those ruins thought they were uncovering treasure. Instead, they'd found evidence of humanity's most dangerous invention, a technology so powerful it could literally tear apart the fabric of civilization itself. And the most chilling part? The machine they'd uncovered was still running, still claiming victims, still spreading its influence across cultures and centuries, like a virus that had learned to hide in the very structure of human social organization. Next, we'll explore how this ancient technology migrated through history, adapting to new cultures while maintaining its core function of turning human intimacy into a weapon of mass destruction. The monastery bells rang across the Irish countryside, calling monks to morning prayers, but in the scriptorium Brother Aelred was scratching out another name from the village records. Not because the man had died, but because he'd been accused of something that made death look merciful. The quill trembled in his hand as he drew the black line through another life, another soul condemned to a fate the Church had imported directly from the ashes of pagan civilizations. Christianity had arrived in Viking lands promising salvation, but what it actually delivered was amplification. The new religion didn't dismantle the machinery of sexual destruction, it upgraded it with divine authority. Where Norse law had offered earthly consequences, Christian doctrine added eternal damnation. Where Viking punishment ended at death, Christian torment extended beyond the grave into infinite suffering. Watch how seamlessly the technology transferred. Arga became sodomitus. The word changed, the language shifted, but the fundamental mechanism remained identical. Accusations still triggered destruction. Combat was replaced by confession, but the outcome stayed the same. Social death wrapped in different vocabulary. But here's where Christians truly innovated. They made the system universal. Viking sexual policing had focused primarily on the passive partner, the penetrated, the feminized. Christian condemnation swept wider, catching both participants in its net. The active partner, previously less stigmatized under Norse custom, now faced equal damnation. The machinery expanded its reach, claiming twice as many victims. The confession system created horrors that made Viking combat look merciful. At least sword fights were brief, violent but quick. Christian penance stretched psychological torture across years, decades, entire lifetimes. Describe your sins in detail. Enumerate every failure of masculine performance. Relive your shame before God and priest in sessions that never truly ended. Monasteries became testing laboratories for perfecting the system. Men sworn to celibacy, living in close quarters, terrified of their own bodies and each other's proximity. Every natural response became potential sin. Every human feeling required detailed confession. Every glance, every accidental touch, every involuntary reaction transformed into evidence of spiritual corruption. The written word amplified consequences beyond anything Vikings had imagined. Their accusations were oral, limited by memory and geographic proximity. Christian records were permanent, archived, preserved for eternity. Your destruction was literalized in Latin, documented in ledgers that would outlive your body, your family, your entire bloodline. Brother Thomas of Canterbury learned this when he confessed to impure thoughts about his fellow monks. The confession was recorded, copied, sent to Rome for theological review. Within months, his name appeared in canonical texts as an example of monastic corruption. His shame became immortalized, studied by scholars, cited in theological debates. He'd achieved the worst kind of fame, eternal infamy preserved in sacred text. But the cruelest Christian innovation was making the system self-enforcing through internalized terror. Vikings required external accusation to trigger their legal machinery. Christians eliminated that limitation by turning conscience itself into the accuser. Your own thoughts became evidence of corruption. Your dreams required confession. Your body's involuntary responses demanded penance. The vocabulary explosion reveals Christian obsession taken to new extremes. Where Old Norse had 7 words for sexual passivity, Church Latin developed dozens of categories, subcategories, degrees of sin. The taxonomy of destruction became a theological science, with scholars competing to identify ever more precise gradations of damnation. Canon lawyers crafted legal frameworks that made Viking law look primitive. Ecclesiastical courts handled soul crimes while secular authorities maintained blood justice. The accused faced double jeopardy, earthly punishment and eternal torment. The systems reinforced each other, creating inescapable webs of destruction that spanned both worlds. Visual culture transformed but maintained the same obsessive focus. Vikings carved temporary insults into wood. Christians carved permanent warnings into stone. Cathedral facades displayed sodomites tortured in hell, their suffering depicted in loving detail for congregations to contemplate. The message achieved architectural permanence, literally set in stone for centuries of viewing. The most devastating innovation was discovering female sexuality as equally dangerous. Viking blindness toward women's relationships ended abruptly. Christians invented female sodomy, created categories for women's sins, extended the machinery to encompass all human bodies regardless of gender. The loophole that had allowed Viking women relative freedom was systematically sealed. Abbess Hildegard felt this change personally when church investigators arrived at her convent in 1147. Relationships between nuns that had existed openly for decades suddenly required examination, documentation, judgment. Women who had found comfort in each other's arms faced the same accusations that destroyed men. The machinery had achieved total coverage. But here's where Christian sexual policing revealed its ultimate sophistication. They created forgiveness that didn't actually forgive. The promise of redemption came with permanent marking. You could confess, perform penance, receive absolution, yet remain forever suspect. Grace was offered with one hand while shame was branded with the other. The double bind created perfect psychological torture. Admit your sins and face eternal documentation of corruption. Deny them and face accusation of prideful deception. Either path led to destruction, just through different mechanisms. The Church had perfected what Vikings only attempted, inescapable condemnation disguised as divine mercy. Conversion narratives from former Viking territories reveal the priorities clearly. Sagas celebrating Norse acceptance of Christianity focused obsessively on sexual transformation. Former raiders proved their Christian virtue by policing sexuality more vigorously than they'd ever policed anything else. The religion changed, but the obsession intensified beyond recognition. The enforcement mechanisms evolved to match available technologies. Viking accusations required public forums and physical proximity. Christian surveillance penetrated private spaces through confession, creating systems where every believer became an informant against themselves. The panopticon was built from human conscience, more effective than any external prison. Architecture reflected these new priorities. Viking halls had been designed for public accusation and witness. Christian churches created confessional spaces, intimate architectures of shame where destruction became personal, private, infinitely repeatable. The same accusation could be confessed repeatedly, each time reopening wounds that never healed. Legal fusion created hybrid nightmares. Christian law layered onto surviving pagan customs produced systems of double punishment that defied rational comprehension. Ecclesiastical courts handled spiritual crimes, while secular courts maintained physical penalties. The accused faced parallel prosecutions that reinforced each other's condemnations. The international spread of Christian sexual policing reveals its viral nature. The system didn't just convert individuals, it infected entire cultures. Each new territory brought fresh populations to process through machinery that had been refined across centuries of operation. The technology was exportable, scalable, infinitely adaptable. Medieval medical texts show the sophistication of Christian psychological warfare. Doctors documented epidemic levels of what they called melancholia among monks, symptoms that modern psychiatrists would recognize as severe depression and anxiety disorders. The system was literally driving its subjects insane, but madness was reinterpreted as spiritual crisis requiring more intensive intervention. The economic model reveals Christian sexual control as fundamentally extractive. Penance required payment. Confession demanded donation. Absolution came with financial cost. The Church had monetized shame itself, creating revenue streams from human misery that funded cathedral construction and institutional expansion. But the most chilling aspect of Christian innovation was its temporal expansion. Viking punishment ended with death, offering at least the mercy of finality. Christian condemnation extended beyond death into eternity. Hell was populated primarily with sexual deviants whose torments would never end, whose suffering would continue long after their accusers had been forgotten. The imagery was deliberately constructed to maximize terror. Medieval descriptions of hellish punishment for sexual sins were graphic beyond modern tolerance, designed to embed permanent psychological scars in anyone who heard them. Children learned to fear their own bodies through stories of eternal torture that awaited natural human responses. This wasn't accidental excess. This was engineered control taken to its logical conclusion. Christians had recognized the power of Viking sexual policing and refined it into something approaching perfection. They'd created a system that claimed authority over not just behavior but thought itself, not just life but afterlife, not just individuals but entire civilizations. The machine had evolved from crude Viking mechanics into sophisticated Christian engineering, but it was still the same fundamental technology. Weaponized shame designed to prevent human connection through systematic terror. The methods had become more subtle, more pervasive, more inescapable, but the core function remained identical. And this Christian refinement of ancient sexual control would prove to be just another stepping stone in the machine's evolution, as new civilizations discovered new ways to perfect humanity's oldest method of social domination. The Ottoman palace guards moved through the harem with practiced silence, their soft shoes making no sound on marble floors as they approached the woman who'd been marked for tonight's lesson. She knelt in the corner, hands folded in apparent prayer, but her trembling betrayed her knowledge of what was coming. This wasn't random selection or spontaneous violence. This was the Christian system of sexual control evolved into Ottoman perfection. The Ottomans had studied Christian methods carefully, adopting what worked while discarding what seemed inefficient. Why destroy people through confession when you could control them through possession? Why threaten eternal damnation when you could deliver immediate visible consequences? The Empire had taken Christian sexual policing and industrialized it. The harem system represents the ultimate refinement of technologies we've traced from Viking longships through Christian monasteries. Here was sexual control perfected into an art form, complete with quality metrics, performance evaluations, and systematic disposal protocols that made previous methods look amateur by comparison. But the true innovation wasn't the harem itself. That was just the visible component of a much larger machine. The real breakthrough was the Devshirm system, the child collection program that made Viking boy snatching look random and unorganized. Every 3 to 7 years, Ottoman officials would fan out across Christian territories with the precision of modern corporate recruiters. The specifications were exact. Boys between 8 and 18, physically perfect, virgin status verified, intelligence tested through standardized procedures. They weren't just taking children randomly. They were shopping for human raw material according to carefully developed criteria that had been refined across centuries of operation. The beauty of the system was its bureaucratic legitimacy. These weren't raids or kidnapping operations. They were official state programs with proper documentation, legal authority, administrative oversight. Parents couldn't resist because resistance meant confronting the full power of the Ottoman state. Cooperation was rewarded, defiance was crushed. The collection process itself was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. Officials would arrive with gifts, promises, elaborate ceremonies that transformed abduction into honor. Selected boys were told they were blessed, chosen for divine service, destined for greatness. The trauma was wrapped in celebration, making resistance seem like ingratitude. Imagine watching your 8-year-old son selected for imperial service. The official language was all honor and opportunity. The practical reality was that you'd never see him again, never know what happened to him, never even learn whether he survived the transformation process. But you were expected to smile and express gratitude for this devastating privilege. The training facilities reveal the system's true sophistication. These weren't simple military schools or administrative academies. They were human processing centers designed to completely erase existing identity while installing new programming optimized for imperial service. The psychological techniques would impress modern cult programmers. Boys entered with names, families, cultural identities, personal histories. They emerged as perfectly calibrated instruments of Ottoman power, their original selves so thoroughly destroyed that former identities became literally unthinkable. The transformation was total, irreversible. more complete than death because consciousness survived to serve new masters. The hierarchy within these schools created additional layers of control. Senior students, themselves products of the same system, enforced discipline on newcomers with the zealotry of converts. Victims became perpetrators, maintaining the machinery that had destroyed them. The system reproduced itself through generational trauma. Sexual control was woven throughout every aspect of training. Boys learned that their bodies belonged to the state, that personal desires were rebellion, that intimacy was treason. The lessons were enforced through methods that made Christian confession look gentle, physical punishment combined with psychological manipulation to create perfect submission. The graduation process sorted boys into different tracks according to imperial needs. Some became janissaries, the elite military units that would conquer Europe. Others entered palace service, their lives dedicated to maintaining the very system that had consumed them. The most broken became eunuchs, their bodies permanently altered to serve in roles requiring absolute trust. But here's where Ottoman innovation truly excelled. They recognized that destroying people completely was wasteful. Better to break them partially, leaving enough intact to serve efficiently while eliminating any possibility of resistance or independent thought. The calibration was precise, creating servants who functioned perfectly within designated parameters. The legal framework supporting this system was breathtaking in its comprehensiveness. Every aspect of sexual behavior was regulated, categorized, subject to state control. The empire had laws governing who could touch whom, when, how, under what circumstances. Intimacy itself became a form of bureaucratic procedure. Women in the harem faced parallel processing, though their destruction followed different patterns. Where boys were broken through systematic training, women were controlled through competitive isolation. Hundreds of women competing for imperial attention, turning natural solidarity into mutual surveillance and sabotage. The selection process for harem women reveals Ottoman efficiency in human acquisition. Slave markets operated like modern supply chains, with standardized pricing, quality grades, return policies. Beauty was commodified, youth was monetized, virginity carried premium pricing. Human beings became luxury goods with specific market values. The disposal methods show Ottoman innovation at its most chilling. Women who aged out or fell from favor weren't simply killed. That would waste valuable assets. Instead, they were recycled through systems that maximized their utility, even in destruction. Some became servants, others were sold to provincial governors. The least useful simply vanished. The bureaucracy of sexual control reached levels that would impress modern corporate managers. Officials tracked inventory, monitored performance, evaluated efficiency, submitted regular reports on system operation. Murder became a line item in administrative budgets. Rape was a scheduled activity with quality control standards. The religious justification layered Islamic theology over the same basic structure Christians had used. Different vocabulary, same function. Allah's will replaced Christ's judgment, but the machinery operated identically. Divine authority sanctified systematic brutalization while preventing moral questioning. The international impact of Ottoman sexual control technology was enormous. European observers were simultaneously horrified and fascinated, condemning the system while studying its methods for potential adaptation. The machinery was too effective to ignore, too useful to abandon entirely. The longevity of Ottoman sexual policing reveals its fundamental utility to power structures. For over 6 centuries, the system operated with minimal modification, processing millions of human beings through mechanisms that remained remarkably stable across changing political circumstances. The technology was mature, proven, reliable, but the Ottoman Empire's eventual collapse demonstrates the ultimate limitation of such systems. Societies that consume their own people eventually exhaust their human resources. The machinery becomes too expensive to maintain, too destructive to sustain, too obviously harmful to justify. The very efficiency that made it powerful made it ultimately self-defeating. Yet even as the Ottoman Empire crumbled, the sexual control technology it had perfected continued to spread, adapt, find new hosts. The machine had learned to survive the death of its creators, jumping from civilization to civilization, like a virus seeking fresh populations to infect. The modern world inherited these systems in forms so familiar we barely recognize their origins. The same fundamental technology that powered Viking law, Christian confession, and Ottoman harems now operates through different mechanisms, but serves identical functions, preventing human intimacy through weaponized shame. The same accusation that triggered combat in Viking halls now triggers violence in school hallways. The weapons changed, but the wound remains identical. The machinery the Vikings built has outlived their gods, their language, their entire civilization, adapting like a virus that learned to hide in human social DNA. Watch how perfectly it translated across centuries. Viking Arga became Christian sodomite, became Victorian invert, became modern slurs. The vocabulary mutates with each generation, but listen to the fear beneath the words. The same terror of masculine contamination, the same demand for violent proof of heterosexual purity, the same social death awaiting those who fail the test. The legal framework evolved while maintaining core structure. Viking trial by combat became Christian penance, became criminal prosecution, became social media cancellation. The enforcement mechanisms shifted from axes to authorities to algorithms, but the destruction adapted to whatever technology each era provided. Every generation thought they were progressing beyond such primitive brutality. Enlightenment philosophers medicalized what Vikings had criminalized, creating psychiatric diagnoses where there had been accusations. The destruction became scientific, wrapped in clinical vocabulary, but the outcome remained social annihilation. The Industrial Revolution democratized the technology. Where Viking accusations required public forums and physical proximity, urban anonymity enabled systematic destruction at unprecedented scale. Factory cities created new surveillance methods, new ways to police masculinity, new mechanisms for turning neighbour against neighbour. Modern variations seem different but operate identically. Playground taunts that mandate violent response, locker room hierarchies that punish deviation, online harassment campaigns that destroy lives through coordinated shame. The same fundamental machine functions through whatever medium each era provides. The persistence reveals the system's elegant design. It requires no central authority, no explicit laws, no formal enforcement. It runs on fear alone, each generation teaching the next to police themselves. The machinery reproduces through cultural transmission more reliable than genetic inheritance. Schools became primary training grounds where boys learn that certain accusations demand violent response. They don't know they're reenacting thousand-year-old legal codes. They think they're just surviving adolescence. The playground dynamics are pure Viking law translated into modern contexts. Corporate environments developed sanitized versions of ancient practices. Not axes, but exclusion from professional networks. Not combat, but career destruction. Not blood, but systematic erasure from economic opportunity. The glass ceiling has a twin called the lavender ceiling, and it operates through identical mechanisms. Military institutions perfected the Viking template through systematic contradiction. Intense male bonding required for unit cohesion combined with terror of that bonding crossing undefined boundaries. The pressure cooker creates warriors who police each other more effectively than any external authority. Sports culture maintains the tradition most transparently. Physical combat sublimated into competition. Team bonding that must never become affection. Locker room enforcement of boundaries that echo mead hall dynamics. Vikings would recognize every element instantly. Digital platforms amplified the machinery's global reach. One accusation can now destroy internationally, instantly, permanently. The internet archives shame with photographic precision. Social media creates permanent records that make medieval chronicles look temporary. The technology scales infinitely. But here's the revelation that changes everything. The machine persists not because it serves human flourishing, but because it serves power itself. Isolated men are easier to govern. Fearful men don't form threatening alliances. Atomized individuals make ideal consumers, perfect workers, controllable citizens. Each era's rulers discovered the same essential tool. Vikings maintained warrior hierarchies through sexual terror. Christians enforced religious conformity through shame-based control. Ottomans prevented rebellion through systematic brutalization. Modern systems maintain economic compliance through identical methods wrapped in therapeutic language. The international spread proves universal application. Cultures with no historical connection independently developed similar mechanisms. The technology appears wherever masculine dominance requires protection through male isolation. It's not culturally specific, it's structurally inevitable. Resistance movements reveal the machinery through opposition. Every push for male emotional freedom triggers violent backlash from those most imprisoned by the system. Victims become the most vicious enforcers, protecting cages they can't recognize as imprisonment. The cycle perpetuates through Stockholm Syndrome on civilizational scale. Mental health statistics document the ongoing damage: male suicide rates, addiction patterns, emotional isolation, touch starvation. The casualties fill therapy offices describing symptoms of wounds inflicted by systems they don't recognize. Ancient trauma manifests through modern pathology. The machine evolved perfect camouflage. What looks like natural masculine behavior is actually learned performance designed to prevent connection. What feels like personal choice is collective programming, transmitted through generations of traumatized fathers teaching sons to fear their own hearts. But understanding the machine's history reveals its weakness. Any system based entirely on fear contains instructions for its own destruction. The very intensity required to maintain such comprehensive control eventually exhausts those enforcing it. The machinery consumes its operators along with its victims. The most hopeful realization is this: none of this is inevitable. The boundaries that feel natural are actually artificial constructions maintained through deliberate effort. The fears that seem instinctive are learned responses that can be unlearned. The isolation that appears necessary is engineered separation that can be bridged. Those Viking warriors standing frozen on that longship deck watching their chief destroyed thought they were witnessing immutable law. They couldn't imagine alternatives because the system had made alternatives unthinkable. But every system of control depends on collective agreement to participate. The moment enough people recognize the machine and refuse to operate it, the entire structure collapses. Not through violent revolution, but through simple withdrawal of cooperation. The prison exists only as long as inmates agree to guard each other. Today, scattered across every culture touched by this ancient technology, men are beginning to recognize the bars. They're realizing that the isolation they accepted as natural was deliberately manufactured. They're discovering that connection is possible, despite 1,000 years of conditioning designed to prevent it. The machine that began on Viking longships, that refined itself through Christian monasteries, that perfected itself in Ottoman palaces, that adapted itself to modern contexts, finally faces its greatest threat. Not external opposition, but internal recognition. The virus is being identified by its own hosts. The cure isn't complicated, it's terrifyingly simple. Stop operating the machine, stop policing each other, stop accepting isolation as protection, stop teaching children that intimacy is dangerous, stop perpetuating systems that turn human connection into threat. The Vikings built something that outlived their gods because they embedded it in human behavior itself. But human behavior can change. What was learned can be unlearned. What was constructed can be deconstructed. What was weaponized can be disarmed. The sun that set on that longship deck 1,000 years ago is finally rising on a world where men might touch each other without triggering ancient programs of mutual destruction. Where friendship doesn't require warrior poses. Where love doesn't demand blood sacrifice. The machine is breaking down, the virus is losing hosts, the prison doors are opening, and for the first time in a millennium, that's not a threat to fear, but a freedom to embrace. The choice is ours. The future is unwritten. The machine only runs as long as we agree to operate it. It's time to turn it off.